Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and attention this week. I want to thank you in advance. We expect to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that on November the 26th of 2016, Joel Michael Guy Sr. was viciously attacked in his home in the exercise room that he had upstairs. During this assault, he sustained 42 sharp force injuries. You're going to hear proof from the medical examiner and from a forensic anthropologist about these injuries. And what you're going to hear is that these injuries were so severe that marks were left on his ribs, 12 of his ribs, marks ranging from scratches to complete severing. The medical examiner is going to tell you that the cause of his death was multiple sharp force injuries that caused damage to his lungs, to his liver, and to his kidneys. He sustained a wound to his scapula, which is where your shoulder is, and it was such a severe wound that a fragment from a blunt force instrument was left in the muscular tissue next to the bone. He sustained abdominal wounds, so he was attacked from the front as well as the back. You're going to hear testimony that most of the stab wounds occurred in the back portion of his body. His hands were severed at the wrists. And you're going to hear evidence that there was a lot of blood staining evidence in this exercise room that indicated that there was a fierce struggle. In one corner of the room, there is blood evidence to show that there was thrashing motion. It left not only blood marks, but wipe marks and droplets on two walls of the room and extensive blood staining on the carpet. You will hear that he sustained defensive injuries on both of his hands, which indicate that he was fighting and he fought for his life. And his hands were sliced. And you're going to see photographs and hear testimony about the nature and the extent of these injuries. After he was murdered, the killer disrobed him, meticulously took off his clothes, his shoes, his pants, his shirt and jacket, and left them in a heap on the carpet. He left Joel Sr.'s cigarettes on top of the pile, and they were blood-stained. He left his hands in the room. At some point, Lisa Guy came home, and she too was subjected to a violent assault. And you're going to hear testimony and see proof of her injuries. She was stabbed 31 times, and she sustained serious injuries to her ribs. She had 21 rib injuries. 21. 9 of her ribs were severed. And you will hear a forensic anthropologist talk to you about the variation of the injuries to her ribs, indicating not just slice marks, scratches, severing, but also evidence that the sharp instrument used to stab her twisted into the cartilage of her ribs. She had one rib that was fractured from blunt force trauma, not sharp force, but blunt force, indicating that there was pressure applied to her ribs. And you will hear that most of these injuries occurred to her back. She had one injury to her clavicle and a stab wound, and she had several stab wounds to her buttock. You will hear testimony that there was evidence in the upper hall at the top of the stairwell from the bottom floor to the top floor that indicates that this is where her murder took place. Blood staining on the walls, drip marks, marks that indicate a spray, perhaps, And like Joel Sr., her clothes were removed from her. They were cut off and left in a bloody pile on top of a large blood stain on the carpet. You will hear that the scissors were found there, along with a knife. You will hear that there were also 2 knives left in the exercise room. So at some point, after Joel Sr. and Lisa were murdered, the killer went to work on their bodies. Joel Sr.'s arms, both of them, were severed at the joint, the shoulder blade. Both of his legs were removed at the hip. His right foot was removed at the ankle. And as you know, his hands, of course, were also removed at the wrist. Lisa had both of her arms removed from her torso at the shoulder. Both of her legs were cut off below the knee. Her right hand was severed from her arm. And the killer cut off her head. You will hear testimony from a forensic anthropologist who will tell you that her head was basically broken from a part of the spine called the atlas. There was a blunt force trauma applied to her neck before her head was severed from her spine. After the limbs of these people were removed, the killer placed them separately into 2 45-gallon blue Sterlite containers. You will hear testimony and see evidence of where that took place. And you will learn that in the master bedroom of their home, plastic sheeting was placed on the floor, and these blue plastic bins were placed on the sheeting. The killer put Lisa's body parts in one, and he put Joel Sr.'s in the other. And then he covered them with a corrosive substance and left them there to liquefy into some sort of diabolical stew of human remains. And then the killer took Lisa's head and carried it downstairs and took it into the kitchen. He got out a stock pot, placed her head in the pot, filled it with liquid, carried it over to the stove, covered it, turned on the stove, and left it there to cook. So, you will hear some proof from family members about this family. And you're going to hear this photograph was taken on the Thanksgiving day just before their murders, November the 24th. The photograph is taken by Michelle Dennison, Joel Sr.'s daughter. And you're going to hear a little bit about this family. You're going to hear that Joel and Lisa were very happily married. They loved each other. They had been married for 31 years. And the defendant was their only child. But Joel Sr. had been married before, years before, and he had 3 daughters, Candace and twins, Michelle and Angela. And you're going to hear from each of them a little bit about their family. And you're going to hear that they communicated regularly, and they had a great relationship with their dad and with Lisa, whom they were very fond of. Lisa had treated them like they were her own. You're going to hear a little bit about the dynamics of this family, and you're going to hear that on Thanksgiving, Joel and Lisa had arranged to have a family get-together. And Michelle and her boyfriend and her 3 young sons, who are depicted in this photograph, came to spend the day, all that Thursday, came to spend the day with Lisa and Joel. Angela and Shandis weren't able to come, so it was just these people, along with the defendant, who came up from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he lived. He drove up the day before, November the 23rd. You're going to hear that this was going to be, and I'm not being smart aleck, when I say it was going to be their last Thanksgiving in this home that they had on Golden View Lane in Knox County, because they were moving. Joel and Lisa had plans. Joel had worked as a contractor. He designed piping systems. Lisa had a job with Jacobs Engineering. She was a disbursement specialist. And they were done with work. Lisa had turned in her notice. Joel's contract was concluded, and they had decided to retire for a while, and they were moving. Their house was for sale. They had a contract on it, and Joel was going to buy his family home in Surgoinsville, Tennessee, in Upper East Tennessee, near Kingsport. And he had made arrangements with his sister, Robin White, to purchase the home, and this was going to be the last Thanksgiving that the family was going to spend in Knoxville. Their next holiday plans were going to be for Christmas in Surgoinsville. They were ready, to move on and to enjoy what was left of their lives. So, I want to give you an idea of kind of a timeline for where we are this weekend. And you're going to see that the defendant came to Knoxville from Baton Rouge on November the 23rd. The family get-together was on Thanksgiving the 24th. You will hear proof that on November the 25th, Joel and Lisa and the defendant drove up to Surgoinsville to deliver a boat that Joel Sr. had, and he wanted to take it to the Surgoinsville house. You will see and hear evidence that Lisa was alive on November the 26th, sometime after noon. We know that because of evidence we have from a shopping trip that she made in Knoxville. And we know that the defendant was in Knoxville on November the 26th, also because of evidence we have from a receipt where he went shopping at a store, a Walmart store, and was seen there around 3:35. The evidence will show that Joel and Lisa were murdered on Saturday, November the 26th. You will hear proof that the defendant left Knoxville at some point on November the 27th, and you will hear proof that the guys' bodies were found on Monday, November the 28th.